What would you do if the only thing your mentor left you was a trade no one wanted, a leather satchel full of tools, and a deed to a strip of land that everyone in the county called a fool's errand? What if standing by that inheritance cost you your last coin and your last roof? And you arrived alone and nearly broke, at the edge of a logging town that had already decided it didn't need you. For Elodie Vance, that wasn't a question she had the luxury of turning over. It was already her life, arriving in Harrow Creek on a gray October morning in 1893 with mud on her boots and not much else. So settle in, wherever you're watching from across this country, and let us tell you about a young woman who lost everything and found, pressed inside a rotting old ledger in a stone workshop no one had opened in 14 years, the truth that an entire valley had been waiting to breathe. She was 22 years old, a bookbinder's apprentice, who had spent 4 years learning the trade from the man who had taken her in after her mother died. Old Theron Malt, the most precise and patient craftsman she had ever known. Theron had run a small bindery in Sudbury for 30 years. He bound court documents, land registries, parish records, and the occasional novel for the few families in the district who read for pleasure. He had no children of his own. When he passed in August of that year, quietly and without drama, leaving behind nothing but tools, debts she had not incurred, and a puzzling strip of land registered in his name near a mill town called Harrow Creek. Most people assumed Elodie would settle the debts and move on. She had not moved on. She had packed Theron's bone folder into her satchel, a flat, smooth tool carved from deer bone, worn glossy along its edge from decades of use, initialed TM in his careful hand, and she had gone to Harrow Creek instead, because Theron had told her to, in the last clear conversation they'd had before the fever made everything foggy. Go and see what's there, he'd said, his eyes still sharp even when the rest of him wasn't. It isn't nothing. Whatever they tell you, it isn't nothing. She had believed him. That belief was the thing keeping her moving when Harrow Creek's main street opened up before her and offered her, in immediate and efficient order, 3 slammed doors, a landlady who apologized while clearly expecting her gone by morning, and the particular cold shoulder that small Ontario towns reserve for people who arrive alone and female and without obvious means. The town was owned, in every practical sense, by Dorian Wycliffe, mill operator and principal employer of half the families in the valley. He was not a large man, wiry, gray at the temples, with the permanent squint of someone who has spent years looking at ledgers in bad light. He received Elodie in the front room of his mill office behind a desk that was deliberately too wide, and told her that Theron Malt's land was a swampy, timbered mess no one could use for anything, that the deed was likely imprecise given Theron's age and the conditions under which it was drawn, and that he was prepared to offer her a fair price simply to put the whole matter to rest. He was a good man, your Theron, Wycliffe said, in a voice calibrated precisely to sound like kindness. But he was getting on. Men his age get attached to things that aren't worth attaching to. Elodie took the paper he slid across the desk, looked at the number written on it, and slid it back. It was his, she said. That makes it worth something. Something in Wycliffe's eyes went flat and still. He thanked her for her time. The meeting was over in the way that things are over when a powerful man decides they are. There was one other voice in Harrow Creek that spoke to her with anything approaching honesty. Near the end of the main street, an old Métis woman named Bernice Colm sold spruce gum salve and woven sweetgrass baskets from a narrow porch, wrapped in a Hudson's Bay blanket against the October wind. She had watched Elodie come and go from Wycliffe's office without any visible surprise. As Elodie passed, Bernice stopped her with a single quiet word. "He's afraid of paper," the old woman said, not looking up from her weaving. Elodie paused. "Pardon?" "A man like that. He's not afraid of people. He's not afraid of trouble." Bernice's fingers kept moving through the sweetgrass, steady and unhurried. "He's afraid of paper." Elodie didn't understand. She nodded and kept walking, and Bernice's words sat at the back of her mind like a splinter she couldn't quite reach, small, specific, insistent. She had just enough money for 2 nights at the rooming house. On the second evening, the landlady told her apologetically, but firmly, that the room was needed, and Elodie would have to find other arrangements by morning. She didn't say who needed it. It had the texture of an arranged inconvenience, neat and plausibly deniable. So on the second night, with her satchel over her shoulder and the October air sharpening into something genuinely dangerous, Elodie Vance walked to the edge of town to find the piece of land Theron had left her. It was not as useless as Wycliffe had implied. The parcel sat at the mouth of a narrow tributary creek, sheltered by a stand of white birch and a low limestone outcropping. There had been a structure there once. She could see the ghost of it in the foundation stones, half buried in moss. And tucked against the rock face, barely visible behind years of encroaching scrub, was a low building she had nearly walked past entirely. Stone walls, a roof that had somehow held, a door swollen shut with decades of damp. She forced it open with her shoulder, and a length of fallen birch, and peered inside. A workshop, or it had been. The air was cold and close and smelled of something she recognized at once. A smell that had followed her through 4 years of apprenticeship, linseed oil, and leather, and old paper. Along one wall, beneath a fall of cobwebs, sat a workbench. Above it, mounted to stone, were rusted tool hooks, a press, a cutting board gone gray with age. Someone had run a bindery here, in this room, in this nobody's corner of the valley. She found the proof of it on the inside of the door, an old wax paper label, the kind Theron used to mark his locations. T. Malt, document bindery est 1879, 14 years ago. He had been here before Sudbury. This was where he had started, and he had told her to come, and now she was here, and the cold outside was serious, and she had nowhere else to be. She made herself as warm as she could, wrapped herself in her wool coat, ate the last of the bread she'd carried from the rooming house, and told herself she would look properly in the morning, that she needed to sleep first. She did not sleep. She sat on the cold floor of Theron's old workshop, listening to the creek run somewhere in the dark, and let the certainty build quietly in her chest that there was something here, that he had not told her to come for sentimentality. Theron Mole had not been a sentimental man. She lit her small lantern just before dawn, and she began. The workshop gave itself up slowly. Most of what she found was what she expected. Ruined tools, dried paste, a water-stained ledger blank she couldn't use. But the press, a heavy iron standing press bolted to the workbench, was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. She ran her hands over it the way Theron had taught her to read a piece of equipment, not just look at it. The base was too thick, not dramatically. But her hands knew a press. She had operated one every working day for 4 years, and this one had an extra 2 inches of iron at its base that served no mechanical purpose she could identify. She took the bone folder from her satchel and ran its tip slowly around the base's edge. On the 3rd pass, she felt the pin. It released when she pressed. The base swung outward on a hinge that still moved smoothly, as though it had been oiled not so long ago. Inside, a single bound volume, wrapped in oilcloth, precisely, carefully sealed, the way a man who understood paper would seal something he intended to keep safe through years and seasons and the slow work of damp. Now we have to stop here for just a moment, because we want to know. If you had followed someone you trusted to a stone room in a birch forest and found something hidden where no one else would think to look, what would you expect to find? Leave it in the comments, because what Elodie found in that oilcloth was not what she expected either, and it changed everything that came after. Her hands were trembling as she unwrapped it. She set it on the workbench, under the lantern light, and opened the cover. A land registry ledger, Harrow Creek Township, District of Nipissing, original survey, 1879. The binding was Theron's own work. She could feel it in the way the spine lay flat, the way the signatures sat flush. She knew his hand the way she knew her own reflection. He had made this. He had hidden this. He had kept this for 14 years in a press with a false base, in a workshop he never sold, at the end of a creek nobody visited. The first half of the ledger was a clean, official record. Land parcels numbered and described, proper, unremarkable. But the back half, the pages that should have been blank, was filled. Filled in Theron's angular, careful script, dense with dates and measurements and observations, written in the compressed shorthand of a man who was afraid of being too specific and afraid, in equal measure, of being too vague. She read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. Theron Mole had been the contract document binder for the Harrow Creek District Registry in 1879. He had bound the official land ledgers himself, which meant he had seen every record they contained before they were sealed and filed, and what he had seen had not matched what was later reported. The original survey had registered 12 parcels of timber-bearing land to 12 different settling families. Parcels 1 through 12, clearly bounded, fairly divided, running along both sides of the main creek tributary. Theron had documented each one. Then, below, he had begun recording something else, the new versions. The pages that replaced the originals after he had delivered his bound copies and gone back to his workshop to clean the press. The same parcel numbers, but with boundaries redrawn, subtly, precisely, in a way that would take a trained surveyor to detect, until 8 of the 12 parcels had been effectively absorbed into a single large holding that had the following year become the site of Wycliffe's mill. Dorian Wycliffe had not bought that land. He had paid someone to redraw the maps after Theron had seen the originals. The 8 families had lost their timber rights without ever understanding what had happened to them. They had simply found, when they tried to register their claims, that the land was already titled elsewhere, that there had been, apparently, a misunderstanding about the original boundaries. They were welcome to appeal, of course, but the official record was clear. The official record was a lie, and Theron Mall had kept proof of what the truth had been in the one place in the valley where paper was both protected and invisible. Inside a book, at the bottom of a press, in a workshop no one came to. He had kept it for 14 years because he was afraid. His notes made that plain. I have told no one. I am not brave enough yet, but I will not destroy this. Later, dated just weeks before his death. Elodie knows the press. She will understand the latch. Go and see what's there. She sat on the stone floor with the ledger in her lap, and for a long time she did not move at all. She thought of the families she had seen on Harrow Creek's main street. The ones who worked the mill because they had no other option, because the timberland that should have been theirs was now Wycliffe's enterprise, and they were simply its employees. 8 families. 14 years. She thought of Wycliffe's flat, still eyes across that desk. She understood now what Bernice Colm had meant. He was not afraid of people. He was not afraid of trouble. He was afraid of paper, because paper was the one thing he could not outwit with money or authority, or a desk that was too wide. She wrapped the ledger back in its oilcloth, set it in her satchel beside Theron's bone folder, and thought very carefully about what came next. It was smoke that ended her solitude. A thin gray thread of it, rising from the creek's edge, where she'd risked a small fire for warmth on the 3rd morning. Casimir Doole had been running a trap line through the tributary when he spotted it. No one came to this end of the property. Everyone in the valley knew it belonged, vaguely, to some estate in Sudbury that had never been settled. He came on foot, careful the way men become careful after years in the bush, and he did not call out until he was close enough to be heard without raising his voice. He did not expect to find a young woman sitting cross-legged beside a fire, with a ledger open across her knees, so absorbed she hadn't heard him until he was 20 feet away. When she looked up, she was on her feet in a second, and he saw 2 things at once. That she was exhausted and cold to her bones, and that she was measuring him the way someone measures a situation they have already decided they cannot afford to get wrong. He reached into his pack and set a piece of smoked whitefish and a tin of tea on the ground between them, then stepped back. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in 2 days," he said. She looked at the food, then at him. Then she took it, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire, and the whole story came out. Theron, the deed, Wycliffe's offer, the press, the ledger. He listened without interrupting, which was not nothing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. "I knew Theron Mall," he said. "Crossed paths with him a handful of times over the years. He used to come out here in the summers, check on the property. I always figured he was just an old man who couldn't let go of a place." He turned a stick in the fire. "He talked about you the last time I saw him. Said you were the most careful pair of hands he'd ever trained." Elodie looked at him. "He said that?" "Said you'd know what to do when the time came." Casimir met her eyes. "I think this is the time." He was a trapper and woodsman, not a lawyer, but he knew the valley the way men know land they've walked for 20 years. He confirmed what Theron's notes claimed, that the families he had named, the Beauchamps, the Lafleurs, the Hendersons, and 5 others, had all lost their timber parcels in the same season. All been told the same story about boundary irregularities. All ended up working the mill because they had nothing left to work. Some had tried to protest. None had gotten far. The official record was clear, and the official record was in a stone building in Corbeil, and Wycliffe had friends in stone buildings. But Theron had been careful, and Theron had been patient, and Theron had trained Elodie to be both. Together, over 2 days, they worked through the ledger, matching Theron's annotations to the parcels Casimir knew from the ground. He had surveyed sections of the tributary himself. He could confirm, from memory and from his own measurements, that the boundaries Theron had recorded in the original were accurate, and that what was now filed in Corbeil was not. It was on the 2nd day that Elodie found the thing she hadn't expected, and wouldn't have found if she hadn't been a bookbinder. At the very back of the ledger, behind the last page of Theron's notes, she ran her thumb along the inside of the rear board to check the binding's condition. Old habit, the kind of thing her hands did without being asked, and felt a faint crinkle beneath the paste-down end paper. A small resistance, where the surface should have been perfectly smooth and flat. She worked the bone folder along the channel carefully, the way Theron had taught her to extract damaged documents without tearing them. What she drew out was a single folded piece of paper. Dated November 1879, a letter. It was from the government surveyor, a man named Clifford Rass, addressed to Dorian Wycliffe, short, precise, and written in the tone of someone confirming a transaction already completed. A receipt for the fee paid for adjusting the parcel boundaries as discussed, with a request that Wycliffe ensure the matter remained between gentlemen. It was not just proof that the boundaries had been falsified. It was a record of who had paid for the falsification and what they had paid. Theron had intercepted it, somehow. The notes didn't say how, and hidden it in the one place in the valley where paper was both safe and invisible. Inside a book. Elodie sat back on her heels, and Bernice Combs' voice came back to her with a clarity that lifted every hair on her arms. He's afraid of paper. And then, quieter, what the old woman had not said aloud, but had somehow said anyway. A bookbinder knows that the truth doesn't disappear. It just gets pressed between the pages. She had not been offering a proverb. She had known or guessed, or simply understood, in the particular way that people who have been paying attention for a long time come to understand things. She had been telling Elodie exactly where to look. They did not have long. The cold was deepening towards something serious. The kind of Canadian autumn that does not announce itself so much as simply arrive and make itself at home. On the evening of the third day, the sky above the birch trees went that particular dark blue that precedes a hard freeze. Casimir looked at it and said they needed to move the documents tonight. They had packed the satchel and were working their way along the creek trail, when they heard a voice, out in the dark, in the direction of the main crossing. Someone calling intermittently, in a tone that had nothing theatrical about it. They found him 20 minutes later. A young mill worker, Tad Ferris. One of the men who had stood behind Wycliffe's desk the day he had dismissed Elodie, nodding along like furniture with opinions. Ferris had gone through thin ice at the crossing, gotten himself out, but was soaked through and had lost his bearings in the dark. He stared at Elodie as though she were a consequence he hadn't anticipated. "You're supposed to be gone," he said, through his shaking. "And you're supposed to be warm," she replied. She did not say anything else. She did not remind him of anything. Casimir had the emergency wool out, and they built the fire up and sat with Ferris until he was stable enough to walk. She cleaned the cut on his forehead from the ice's edge and wrapped it with cloth from the medical kit Theron's satchel had always carried. Her hands were steady. She did not feel charitable, exactly. She felt something more practical than that. She simply could not leave him in a ditch because he had once nodded at her from behind the wrong desk. When he left, his eyes were different than they had been. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. 5 days later, Elodie Vance and Casimir Doule walked into the office of the district magistrate in Corbeil with a satchel full of documents. The magistrate was a methodical man named Hargreaves, who had been in the district 30 years and had no particular fondness for Dorian Wycliffe, whom he found imprecise in his dealings and overly confident for someone whose confidence rested on paperwork. Hargreaves had never personally verified. He read every page they placed before him. He read the surveyor's letter twice. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "This has been sitting in the valley for 14 years, he said. "It has," said Elodie. He looked at her over his spectacles. "Your Theron Mall was a careful man." "He was the most careful man I ever knew." What followed was not swift, and it was not dramatic. The law in Northern Ontario in 1893 was a methodical thing, and it took its time. But the surveyor's letter was enough to open an investigation, and the investigation, once opened, found that Wycliffe's friends had not thought to destroy the original township surveys because they had not known that a bookbinder in a stone workshop had already documented the discrepancy before the replacements were filed. Dorian Wycliffe's title to the mill property was suspended pending review. His mill kept operating. The workers still needed wages. But the investigators who arrived in Harrow Creek over the following weeks made the situation plain. The 8 families were notified. Some were incredulous. One old man, Aristide Beauchamp, who had worked Wycliffe's mill for 11 years after abandoning the claim he'd thought was lost, stood in the magistrate's office and read his family's original parcel description from Theron's ledger 3 times before he could speak. He was not a man who cried easily. He cried then. Elodie was not present for all of it. She had done her part, and the machinery moved without her now. She stayed in Harrow Creek through November. She cleaned the old workshop, oiled the press's joints back to working order, and set herself up as the valley's bookbinder. Every town needed one, if it thought about it clearly. She was the best trained one within 100 miles, and Harrow Creek, it turned out, had a great deal of paper that needed binding. On the last night of November, she walked back to the ridge above the tributary, where the birch trees had gone bare and the first permanent snow was beginning to settle over the valley. The creek below was freezing at its edges. She had Theron's bone folder in her hand, not for any particular reason, just to hold. It was smooth in the way that well-used things become smooth, worn by decades of care, initialed in a script she knew as well as her own name. She thought about a man who had spent 14 years carrying a secret he was not brave enough to speak aloud, who had found another way to make sure it would be spoken eventually. He had not trusted institutions. He had not trusted the goodwill of powerful men. He had trusted a pair of careful hands, and a press that knew how to hold a secret until the right person came along to open it. Casimir stood a few feet away, looking at the same dark valley, saying nothing. He had that quality, useful in a person, rarer than it ought to be, of knowing when the quiet was the right thing to offer. After a while he said, "He believed in you." "He believed the truth was worth keeping," Elodie said. "I think he just needed someone else to believe that, too." Below them, in one of the houses off the main road, a lamp went on, then another and another, as the valley settled into its evening. Families who might yet sit on land that was honestly theirs. Not a resolution yet, but the beginning of one. More than had existed the week she arrived in the mud, with nothing but a satchel and a bone folder and a dead man's conviction that what he had left her was not nothing. She pressed her thumb along the edge of the folder, feeling the old smooth groove. He had been right. It was never the land itself. It was what he had trusted her to find in it, and do something with, because he had watched her hands long enough to know they could be trusted with more than leather and paper. The truth doesn't disappear. It waits in the places people call worthless, in the objects people call just keepsakes, in the quiet spaces between the pages of things everyone has already stopped reading. It just needs someone willing to press it open. Thank you for spending this evening with us, and with Elodie. If her story stayed with you, we would be so grateful for a like, a comment, and your subscription to Cottage Stories. There are more tales like this one waiting, from the quiet corners of this country's past, that most history books walk right past without stopping. And before we go, we want to ask you something. Was there something in your own life, an inheritance someone told you wasn't worth keeping, that turned out to be the most important thing you held on to? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.